absorbed into Carthage's army. Carthage valued mercenaries, hiring warriors from all over the world. So instead of Roman legions marching into Gaul or Britannia, we might see mixed Carthaginian forces, Libyan cavalry, Iberian infantry, Numidian horsemen spreading Punic influence across Europe. The dream of a uniform Roman Empire would have been replaced by a patchwork of Carthaginian client states. Religion would have taken a drastically different path as well. Roman mythology, tied to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, might never have risen to dominate European culture. Instead, the Punic gods Bull, Hammon, and Tennecoud had become central deities in the West. Imagine temples to Carthaginian gods standing in Paris or London centuries later. Christianity, which relied on Roman roads and governance to spread, might never have become dominant. The spiritual heart of Europe could have pulsed with Punic rituals, leaving the world's religions unrecognizable compared to today. Economically, Carthage had always been about trade, not conquest. If Hannibal had secured dominance, the focus of Europe might have shifted away from empire building toward commerce. Instead of expansion by sword, influence might have spread through markets, ports, and merchant guilds. Cities like Carthage, Cadiz, and Carthagonova could have risen as glittering centers of wealth. Europe might have become more mercantile than militaristic, with prosperity flowing through the Mediterranean centuries before the rise of modern capitalism. Now, picture, culture, Roman engineering, with its aqueducts, amphitheaters, and concrete roads, might never have defined European identity. Carthaginian cities had their own brilliance, but they valued trade more than monumental construction. Without Rome, perhaps Europe wouldn't have been dotted with colossal stone ruins, but with sprawling marketplaces, harbors, and trade warehouses. The Renaissance, which drew so much from Roman architecture and Latin texts, might never have existed in the form we know. Humanity's art, literature, and knowledge base would look radically different. The balance of power outside Europe would have shifted as well. With Carthage as the supreme Mediterranean power, their influence in Africa might have expanded further south. Carthage had connections deep into the Sahara, and possibly beyond. If strengthened, this might have brought African kingdoms into global trade far earlier than history recorded. Instead of Roman roads leading north, Punic trade routes might have stretched into Southern Africa, building bridges that changed the entire trajectory of global contact. For Rome's neighbors, the story would have been grim. Gaul, Germania, and Britain would never have been conquered by Rome's disciplined armies. Instead, they may have remained tribal, fragmented, or loosely tied to Carthaginian merchants. The unique blend of Roman order with local cultures that shaped Western Europe would be erased. France, Spain, and Britain, as we know them, would not exist. Their languages, laws, and traditions might have been forged in Carthaginian fire rather than Roman steel. The map of Europe would be unrecognizable. Above all, Hannibal's victory would have shifted the cultural center of gravity southward, making North Africa not Italy the engine of Western history. The idea of Europe as the dominant force in global affairs might never have happened. Instead, Africa and the Mediterranean coast would have taken the lead. When we look at modern civilization, with its Roman foundations, we'd see something entirely different. A Carthaginian legacy, built on trade, diversity, and seafaring. The West would not be Romanate, would be Punic. If Hannibal had crushed Rome, the concept of empire itself might have looked very different. Rome built its identity on discipline, law, and expansion by conquest. Carthage, by contrast, was a trading republic. They thrived on negotiation, commerce, and naval dominance. If their system had prevailed, the world might have evolved with a greater emphasis on networks and partnerships instead of raw military conquest. Perhaps the modern idea of capitalism, often tied to later European powers, could have been born centuries earlier. Under Carthage's guiding hand, education and philosophy would have followed another path too. Rome inherited much from Greece and spread it throughout Europe, shaping the Western canon. But Carthage, with its own blend of Phoenician roots and African connections, might have pushed a different intellectual tradition. The languages preserved would not be Latin, but Punic, Phoenician, or a blend with Iberian and Berber dialects. Universities, had they emerged, might have taught texts written in Punic script. The very alphabet on which much of the Western world relies might have looked different today. Consider a military strategy. Rome's greatest strength was the professional legionary system, which created standardized armies capable of long campaigns. If Rome had been defeated, this model might have died early. Instead, Carthage's reliance on mercenaries might have encouraged decentralized warfare. Soldiers would come from diverse cultures, hired for skill and loyalty to coin rather than a nation. Europe might have seen less centralized power, with war becoming a business instead of a civic duty. This would change the way people thought about identity, loyalty, and statehood. Hannibal's victory would also mean the survival and growth of Carthage itself. Historically, Carthage was utterly destroyed in the Third Punic War, with its libraries and culture lost to fire. If Hannibal had won, Carthage might have flourished as a beacon of African innovation. Its lost texts on agriculture, navigation, and astronomy could have reshaped knowledge. Imagine Punic scientific advancements influencing Europe's centuries. Before the Renaissance, what we now attribute to Rome's rediscovery of Greek ideas might instead have been Carthage's preservation and expansion of Phoenician wisdom. Geopolitically, the East would have felt the ripple effect. Rome eventually clashed with the Hellenistic kingdoms and later dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Without Rome, perhaps Carthage and Greece would have formed an uneasy balance. Carthage might not have crushed Greek culture but instead merged with it, creating a hybrid civilization of Punic seafarers and Greek thinkers. The philosophical tradition of Athens could have blended with the mercantile mindset of Carthage, creating an entirely new synthesis of thought that defined the Mediterranean. And what of the Americas? Centuries later, each was a rope built on Roman foundations that expanded across the Atlantic. But if Carthage had ruled, their seafaring tradition might have pushed exploration much earlier. Some historians even speculate that Phoenicians reached the Atlantic long before Rome existed. With Carthage imminent, transoceanic voyages could have happened earlier, with Punic sailors landing on distant shores centuries before Columbus. This would shift not just timelines but the entire story of human contact between continents. On the home front, Roman identity itself might have been instead of rising again from Hannibal's blows, Rome would have been forced into a permanent supporting role. Its proud patricians might have become administrators under Carthaginian oversight, while plebeians served as laborers or traders within Punic markets. The Roman spirit, often praised for resilience, would have been muted. Instead of becoming a model for modern republics and democracies, Rome might have been remembered as a failed experiment crushed by a more pragmatic power. Think of art and culture. Roman mosaics, frescoes, and sculptures filled villas and cities across Europe. Without Rome's rise, this art tradition might never have dominated. Carthage, with its Phoenician roots, valued more abstract designs, intricate trade goods, and religious symbolism. Europe's cultural identity could have leaned toward maritime themes, emphasizing trade, sea gods, and mercantile power, rather than Roman heroes and even modern Western aesthetics might carry Punic patterns rather than Roman arches and columns. The idea of citizenship, too, would have looked different. Rome pioneered the extension of citizenship to conquered peoples, eventually binding diverse groups into a unified empire. If Carthage had ruled, there might never have been a universal citizenship model. Instead, people would identify with city-states or trade alliances, not a grand empire. The sense of being part of Rome that united so many across Europe might never have existed, leaving the continent fragmented but tied by contracts and commerce. And in the long run, the legacy of Hannibal's triumph would mean that when we think of Western civilization, we might not think of Rome at all. Carthage would be the foundation. Our stories, our myths, our languages, and our symbols would bear Punic fingerprints. School children might study Carthaginian battles, merchants, and leaders instead of Julius Caesar or Augustus. The phrase Roman Empire might be a forgotten footnote, while the Carthaginian century became the cornerstone of history. If Hannibal had triumphed, religion in Europe might have evolved down a different road. Rome eventually became the seat of Christianity, spreading the faith throughout Europe and beyond. But with Carthage in charge, pagan traditions rooted in Phoenician gods might have held sway for centuries longer. Temples dedicated to Baal and Tanna could have stood where Roman basilicas later rose. Even Christianity itself might have looked different. perhaps merging with Punic rituals and symbolism instead of Roman administration and law. Economically, the Mediterranean basin would have been transformed. Rome built vast networks of roads that connected its empire, laying the groundwork for future European integration. Carthage, on the other hand, prioritized sea lanes. If Hannibal had prevailed, maritime trade might have become the backbone of civilization. Ports, not roads, would dominate. Coastal cities could have eclipsed inland capitals, and Europe's heartland might have remained rural and disconnected. This would have reshaped urbanization patterns for millennia. Imagine daily life under Carthaginian dominance. Roman citizens were trained to value civic duty, military service, and loyalty to the state. Under Carthage, people might have prioritized business partnerships, trade networks, and mercantile success. Wealth and influence would come less from conquest and more from negotiation. The values of competition and contract might have replaced Rome's legacy of law and civic order. A culture of merchants could have defined Europe instead of a culture of soldiers. Hannibal himself would have become more than a general. He would have been remembered as a world shaper. Rome's legacy is filled with statues of emperors, generals, and lawgivers. In a Carthaginian-dominated world, Hannibal's likeness might have stood in every major city. Celebrated as the man who defeated the indomitable Romans, his strategies would be studied not as a cautionary tale, but as a permanent model of brilliance. Schools of war and commerce alike might have carried his name. The role of women might have shifted as well. Roman society gave women limited roles, mostly tied to family and household. Carthage, while still patriarchal, had traditions of priestesses and more public religious roles for women. If Carthage had ruled, perhaps women would have seen greater early influence in cultural and religious life. Entire traditions of leadership and commerce might have opened sooner for women in Europe, reshaping gender roles long before modern movements. Consider science and exploration. Rome was practical, focused on engineering roads, aqueducts, and cities. Carthage, however, had a deep tradition of navigation and astronomy. Their sailors reached distant lands, and their astronomers charted the stars for trade. A victorious Carthage might have pushed humanity toward exploration of the seas centuries earlier. Instead of waiting for the Age of Discovery in the 15th century, the Punic Age of Discovery might have happened 1,000 years before. The clash between East and West might have taken another form too. Rome eventually collided with Persia and later influenced the rise of Byzantium. But if Carthage had won, the balance between Phoenician African culture and the great powers of the East would have shaped diplomacy. Instead of Roman emperors negotiating with Persian kings, Punic councils might have shared treaties, trade pacts, or wars with Eastern dynasties. This could have created a more balanced world order, with no single empire dominating. Architecture would tell a different story across Europe. Rome filled its cities with massive forums, amphitheaters, and aqueducts. Carthage, meanwhile, built harbors, warehouses, and temples to their gods. Had Hannibal prevailed, Europe's landmarks might not be colosseums or aqueducts, but grand ports and mercantile districts. The pride of civilization would lie in bustling trade hubs rather than massive stone monuments. Even modern skylines might echo Punic sensibilities rather than Roman engineering. The very idea of civilization would have worn a different face. Rome casts itself as the bringer of order against barbarism, spreading Latin culture across conquered lands. Carthage, as a republic of traders, might have defined civilization as a network of commerce and diplomacy. Instead of conquest creating identity, deals and alliances would shape belonging. Europe's future nations might never have emerged as centralized empires, but as confederations of merchants and cities. Finally, the memory of Rome itself would change. Instead of being celebrated as the eternal city, Rome might have been remembered as the empire that almost was. Its ruins would stand as a warning, not an inspiration. Carthaginian historians might have painted Rome as reckless, arrogant, and doomed by its obsession with conquest. In our world, Rome inspires ideas of glory and order. In Hannibal's world, Rome might have symbolized hubris, the giant that fell to a master strategist. If Hannibal's victory had shifted the balance of power, the concept of empire itself might have changed. Rome invented the model of centralized rule, legions enforcing laws, and emperors ruling over. Carthage, however, thrived on networks, agreements, and federations of allies. If Carthage had been the winner, history might have leaned less toward emperors and more toward councils. Instead of centuries of monarchies and dynasties, the world might have followed the path of mercantile education would have taken a different shape too. Roman schools emphasized rhetoric, oratory, and law skills designed for civic life. Carthaginian influence might have put navigation, trade, and mathematics at the core. Children across Europe might have grown up learning how to calculate trade margins or read the stars instead of memorizing speeches from Cicero. The intellectual traditions of Europe could have tilted toward commerce and exploration. Long before the Renaissance, the language map of Europe would also be unrecognizable. Today, Latin gave birth to Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, influencing half the globe. But with Punic dominance, Phoenician and Carthaginian dialects might have seeded entirely new language families. Instead of Romance languages spreading worldwide, Punic tongues could have carried trade jargon across oceans, shaping everything from African ports to American colonies centuries ahead of schedule. Even warfare itself might have been Rome perfected the legion, disciplined soldiers fighting in organized formations. Carthage relied on diverse mercenaries from across its trading empire. If Hannibal had triumphed, the art of war might have leaned toward flexible coalitions instead of rigid armies. Generals could have focused on recruiting diverse fighters, archers, cavalry, and seamen from many regions. Warfare would be about diversity of skill rather than uniformity of discipline. Philosophy under Carthage might have blossomed differently. Roman thinkers absorbed heavily from Greece, eventually preserving and passing it on, but Carthage had close ties with the intellectual centers of the Near East. Knowledge from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond might have become the backbone of Western philosophy instead of Greek traditions. Ideas about time, fate, and the cosmos could have shaped Europe in ways that feel more mystical and less rational. Consider how cities themselves would look. Roman cities were grid-based, with central forums and amphitheaters dominating public life. Carthaginian cities, built around harbors and trade, were fluid, designed for ships and goods. If Hannibal had won, European capitals might have been sprawling port cities instead of inland strongholds. Power would rest in docks and warehouses rather than courts and palaces. Urban life would pulse with markets rather than military parades. Technology's trajectory would be altered too. Roman engineering left aqueducts, roads, and bridges. Carthaginian genius lay in shipbuilding and navigation. Had Hannibal prevailed, Europe's breakthroughs might have leaned toward maritime innovation, advanced ships, long-distance exploration, and even early attempts at oceanic travel could have happened centuries earlier. Instead of Rome's roads leading to London, Carthage's sea lanes might have stretched to the Americas long before Columbus. The role of Africa in global history would also be far greater. Carthage, based in North Africa, would have projected African influence into Europe for centuries. Instead of the Mediterranean being remembered as a Roman lake, it could have been a Punic sea. Africa's culture, gods, and trade might have integrated into Europe's foundations. The idea of Europe as separate from Africa might never have existed in the same way. It would have been one interconnected zone. Even art and literature would shift dramatically. Rome celebrated military glory, epic poetry about heroes, and monumental stone statues. Carthage valued practical records, trade documents, and religious iconography. If Hannibal had won, art might have been less about marble gods and more about colorful mosaics, vivid ports, and symbolic depictions of trade. Epic literature might not praise legions, but instead glorify voyages, bargains, and the cunning of merchants. Finally, the very identity of Europe could have been altered forever. Rome's vision of civilization created the blueprint for empires, law codes, and nations. Carthage's vision was about networks, contracts, and commerce. If Hannibal had won, Europe might not have grown into a land of conquering empires, but into a vast confederation of city-states and trade alliances. The story of humanity would be less about power through conquest and more about survival through connection. The Roman Empire shaped Christianity, but under Hannibal's victory, religion in Europe might have looked very different. Carthage followed gods, tied to trade, storms, and agriculture. Instead of Rome spreading Christian doctrine through its roads and legions, Europe might have inherited Punic spiritual traditions mixed with Mediterranean deities. Faith could have been more polytheistic, rooted in rituals of fertility and navigation rather than churches and saints. The idea of law and justice would also have shifted dramatically. Roman law is the backbone of Europe's modern systems, codifying contracts, rights, and responsibilities. Carthage, as a mercantile power, built laws around trade, negotiation, and diplomacy. If Hannibal had won, the basis of European law might have been more commercial than civic, focusing on agreements and partnerships instead of citizenship and military duty. Rome's obsession with expansion might never have taken hold. Carthage valued profit over territory, alliances over conquests. If Europe grew under Punic influence, colonization could have looked more like trade settlements than vast empires. Instead of Rome's military stamp across continents, Carthage's influence might have been subtler. Ports, markets, and contracts, shaping societies quietly but deeply. The very symbols of power would have changed. Rome celebrated emperors, triumphs, and marble arches. Carthage prized ships, merchants, and council leaders. If Hannibal had carved out victory, the icons of Europe might not be statues of Caesar but carvings of harbors, trading vessels, and councils in session. The cultural imagination would celebrate trade routes as much as battlefields. Even Europe's relationship with the wider world would have shifted earlier. Rome struggled with isolationism before its expansion, but Carthage always looked outward, its sailors navigating beyond Gibraltar, with Carthage at the helm. European contact with West Africa, the Atlantic, and possibly even the Americas could have unfolded far earlier. History books might list Punic explorers centuries before Columbus. The military culture of Europe would feel less rigid. Rome drilled discipline into its legions. Expecting total loyalty, Carthage hired diverse mercenaries, training them to fight under shared contracts. If Hannibal had prevailed, military power in Europe might have leaned toward multinational coalitions rather than uniform armies. Wars would be fought by alliances of varied troops, turning battlefields into melting pots of strategy and skill. The story of slavery might also have looked different. Rome's empire thrived on slaves from conquered lands, shaping its economy and society. Carthage used slavery but relied heavily on hired labor and alliances. If Hannibal had won, Europe might have leaned less on mass enslavement and more on contracted workers. The legacy of slavery across centuries might have been weaker, shaping modern ethics and society differently. Cultural identity could have fused differently too. Rome pressed conquered peoples into Roman identity, Latinizing cultures until they merged. Carthage worked with diversity, blending local traditions into its trading networks. If Hannibal had triumphed, Europe might have celebrated plurality earlier. Instead of everyone becoming Roman, people could proudly remain distinct while bound by trade and diplomacy. Education systems might have been less about oratory and more about practical skills. Roman elites studied speeches and law. Carthage valued calculation, negotiation, and navigation. If Punic victories shaped Europe, classrooms might have taught mapmaking, astronomy, and accounting centuries before such knowledge spread in the Renaissance. Children might have grown up trained for exploration rather than civic debate. Finally, the memory of Hannibal himself would have been transformed. Today, he is remembered as Rome's greatest enemy, a brilliant general who almost broke the Republic. But if he had succeeded, Hannibal might be remembered not as a villain, but as a founder of a new order. His name might stand alongside Alexander the Great, etched in monuments, not just as a warrior, but as the architect of a Punic Europe. The Renaissance in our timeline leaned heavily on Rome's preservation of Greek texts and its influence on European thought. But if Hannibal had triumphed, the cultural wellspring would have flowed from a different source entirely. Imagine libraries filled not with Cicero's speeches or Livy's histories, but with Punic merchant records, astronomical charts from Phoenician sailors, and maps of trade winds connecting Africa to the distant Atlantic. A European rebirth shaped by Carthage would not have been about rediscovering statues and philosophy. It would have been about unlocking new frontiers of exploration, building ships to ride unfamiliar seas, and trading across vast distances. The humanist slogan might not have been back to the Greeks, but forward to the horizon. Knowledge itself would have carried the scent of salt air, the creak of rigging, and the hum of markets bustling with goods from 3 continents. Instead of Michelangelo carving marble or Leonardo sketching flying machines, the stars above might have been the canvas for Punic-inspired visionaries. Europe's Renaissance would not have been painted on chapel ceilings, it would have been plotted on nautical charts, transforming history into an odyssey powered by sails, compasses, and the memory of Hannibal's gamble against Rome. If Hannibal's world had stretched into the Middle Ages, religion in Europe would have taken an entirely different turn. Instead of a unified Christendom led by Rome, Carthage might have fostered a patchwork of spiritual traditions tied to trade networks. The Punic gods like Baal Hammon and Tanit could have remained at the heart of Mediterranean worship, but their myths would mix with Egyptian deities, Berber rituals, and even distant echoes from sub-Saharan beliefs. Imagine cathedrals replaced by seafaring temples, where incense and prayers were offered not toward heaven but toward the ocean, asking for safe voyages and generous winds. Without Rome enforcing orthodoxy, faith would have been more fluid, shifting with the tides and ports. Pilgrimage might not have been about walking to Santiago or Jerusalem, but about sailing to Carthage itself, the holy city of commerce and courage. The religious wars that scarred Europe for centuries might never have erupted in the same way. Instead, conflict could have been about controlling sacred trade routes, turning faith into another extension of maritime strategy. Hannibal's ghost would linger not in statues of saints, but in the waves themselves, whispered in every sailor's prayer before leaving shore. Science, too, would have evolved differently under Carthaginian dominance. Rome prized engineering roads, aqueducts, military logistics. Carthage, by contrast, valued navigation, astronomy, and agriculture. The Punic genius for farming, with their advanced irrigation and crop rotation, could have spread across Europe centuries earlier, reshaping how people ate and lived. Picture this: a cold scientific revolution, not beginning in the 1600s but unfolding much earlier, driven by maritime maps, star charts, and weather patterns. Carthaginian schools might have trained not jurists and rhetoricians, but captains, mapmakers, and agricultural scientists. The telescope could have been invented not in Holland, but in a Phoenician-influenced city along the coast of Africa, built to scan horizons for trade winds, rather than planets. Instead of Galileo clashing with church doctrine, Punic scientists might have debated with Berber shamans or Egyptian priests about the nature of the stars. Progress would have been tied to survival on the seas and prosperity in the fields. Knowledge would not gather dust in monasteries but circulate like currency in the markets of Carthage, traded, tested, and improved with every voyage. In this alternate world, Hannibal's gamble would not just save Carthage, it would accelerate human curiosity by centuries. Politics under a victorious Carthage would have unfolded with an entirely different rhythm. Rome's Senate and imperial model became the skeleton for European states. But if Carthage had dictated the blueprint, democracy might have looked less Roman and more mercantile. Councils of merchants and admirals, elected or appointed, could have formed the backbone of governance. Laws might not revolve around citizenship and military service, but around trade rights, harbor access, and tax on goods. The balance of power would lie not in legions, but in fleets, and political ambition would require navigating not battlefields, but boardrooms filled with scrolls of contracts. Instead of Roman-style emperors crowned in marble halls, Carthage might have created dynasties of merchant princes, remembered less for wars of conquest, and more for voyages of discovery. Borders could have been porous, shifting constantly as alliances rose and fell across the seas. Hannibal's gamble against Rome would echo through these politics, teaching leaders that power was fragile and temporary, unless tied to something bigger. Control of the waves, the Mediterranean would not just be a sea, it would be the parliament of nations, where every decision had global ripples. Culture in a Carthaginian Europe would have looked astonishingly different. Roman culture exalted gladiators, Stoic philosophy, and monumental architecture. Carthaginian culture, shaped by sailors and traders, might have revolved around storytelling, music, and rituals that crossed oceans. Instead of amphitheaters hosting brutal contests, massive harbors could double as cultural festivals, with ships decorated in bright colors, sails painted with myths, and markets buzzing with performances from faraway lands. Literature might have leaned toward travelogues rather than epics, with storytellers recounting journeys past Gibraltar, beyond the known world. Punic art, less about marble perfection and more about practical beauty, might have given Europe a very different aesthetic. Woven patterns, maritime mosaics, and carvings inspired by the endless horizon. Hannibal himself could have been immortalized, not just in statues, but in songs sung by sailors across centuries. A hero who dared to carry elephants over mountains. In this alternate world, Carthage's cultural DNA would not only outlast Rome but redefine what it meant to be civilized. The heartbeat of Europe would not echo in stone arenas, but in the rhythm of waves lapping against merchant ships. By the time of exploration, if Carthage had shaped the old world, the age of discovery might have looked radically different. Instead of Portugal and Spain launching ships westward, it could have been Carthaginian descendants setting sail long before Columbus. With their maritime knowledge, they might have reached the Americas centuries earlier, establishing Punic-style colonies in the Caribbean or along the eastern coasts. These colonies would not have been militarized outposts but commercial hubs, trading with local tribes, blending cultures, and creating hybrid societies. The Columbian Exchange could have started far earlier, changing diets, diseases, and demographics before Europe even entered its renaissance. Potatoes in Africa, African crops in Europe, European goods in the Americas, all mixing under Carthaginian direction. Hannibal's gamble would, in hindsight, look like the moment the world tilted toward a seafaring destiny. Rome gave us empire by land. Carthage might have given us globalization centuries before the word existed. The Punic sails would have been the first flags planted in the New World, rewriting history not through conquest alone but through commerce, negotiation, and persistence. Across endless oceans, the legacy of Hannibal himself would have been profound in this alternate history. Instead of being remembered as Rome's greatest enemy, he would stand as the founding father of a new world order. Statues of him would rise, not just in Carthage, but across Europe and Africa, celebrated as the man who broke Rome and gave birth to centuries of Punic prosperity. His story would not be one of tragic failure, but of triumphant persistence. A boy who swore hatred for Rome and lived to see his vow fulfilled. Children in Punic schools might recite his campaigns the way we recite multiplication tables today. Philosophers might debate his choices not as cautionary tales, but as blueprints for boldness. Hannibal's march over the Alps would symbolize humanity's ability to defy the impossible, a reminder that ambition could move mountains. His spirit would live on not as a ghost haunting Rome's triumphs, but as a guiding star for explorers, generals, and dreamers. Hannibal would be remembered not as the man who almost destroyed Rome, but as the one who actually changed the world's destiny. Even the map of Africa would look different in this Carthaginian-centered history. Instead of being seen as a mysterious continent waiting to be discovered, it would stand as the core of global trade and culture. Carthage, connected to the Sahara through caravan routes and to the coast through its fleets, would weave Africa directly into Mediterranean politics. Timbuktu might have risen centuries earlier as a knowledge hub, tied not to Islamic scholars alone but to Punic merchants, eager for wisdom. Gold, salt, ivory, and ideas would have flowed not through European colonial powers, but under the guidance of Carthage's networks. Africa would not be carved up in the 19th century. It would have been the central player in shaping the medieval and early modern world. Hannibal's gamble, instead of confining Carthage's reach, would have unlocked Africa's voice on the global stage. The world map on classroom walls today might place Africa not as the other, but as the starting point of modern civilization. The balance between East and West would also shift dramatically in a Hannibalic victory world. Rome's fall to Carthage would mean Greece's legacy was filtered differently. Greek ideas, blending with Punic pragmatism, Egyptian mysticism, and Persian influence. Instead of a Europe defined by Greco-Roman thought, it would have been a hybridized Mediterranean civilization. The Silk Road could have opened under Punic supervision, linking China's goods with Carthaginian harbors, creating an even earlier global marketplace. Instead of Marco Polo in the 13th century, Punic ambassadors might have been walking through Mongol courts centuries earlier, introducing Phoenician letters and African crops to Asia. Hannibal's gamble would echo not just across Europe but across Eurasia, blending East and West in ways Rome never achieved. Instead of dividing the world into empires, Carthage might have stitched it together with sails, caravans, and coins, stamped with symbols of eternal trade. Finally, the modern world under a Carthaginian victory would feel utterly unfamiliar. Rome gave us the language of law, empire, and military dominance. Carthage might have given us a planet defined by trade pacts, federations of cities, and cultural hybridity. The Cold War might not have been fought with nuclear weapons, but with embargoes, blockades, and naval rivalries. The very idea of nationalism could be weaker, replaced by loyalty to trade leagues and merchant alliances. The global language might not have been Latin-based English or Spanish, but something rooted in Phoenician, shaped by centuries of cross-cultural exchange. Hannibal's gamble against Rome would, in hindsight, look like the true fork in history. One path led us to empire, conquest, and modern nation-state. The other would have given us a world bound not by borders but by sails, trade winds, and cultural mosaics. A world where Rome never cast its shadow, and where Carthage's flame burned across oceans, instead of fading into ruins. In this alternate timeline, the Punic language might have survived as the dominant tongue of Europe, instead of Latin evolving into Spanish, French, and Italian. Punic roots could have given birth to entirely new language families. Imagine school children in Paris learning not about Caesar's Latin, but about Hannibal's Phoenician-derived tongue, full of maritime terms and words for winds, stars, and trade. The Romance languages as we know them might not exist. Instead, Punic dialects would stretch from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. English, shaped later by Germanic and Latin influences, would have sounded radically different if Punic was its Mediterranean base. Literature, poetry, and even theater would echo with this distinct rhythm, flavored by the sea and commerce. The world's great classics might not include Virgil's Aeneid or Dante's Divine Comedy, but instead sagas of Punic voyages, Hannibalic epics, and lyrical hymns to the horizon. Linguistic history itself would have been rewritten, leaving behind the legacy of Rome's Latin shadow in favor of Hannibal's sea-born voice. Art and architecture would also shift under this Punic dominance. Instead of marble temples and straight Roman roads, cities across Europe would showcase curved harbors, warehouses built like fortresses, and sprawling marketplaces as their central pride. The Colosseum might never exist, but in its place could stand massive coastal amphitheaters, designed for festivals, trade exhibitions, and storytelling. Buildings would not rise to honor emperors but to serve sailors and merchants, decorated with mosaics of ocean creatures and ships. Even palaces might resemble giant docks, with open courtyards filled with goods from Africa, Iberia, and the Levant. The aesthetic would be more practical, less about grandeur for grandeur's sake, and more about function wrapped in beauty. Streets would not be straight lines like Rome demanded, but winding paths following the coastline. Art would celebrate not stoic soldiers, but adventurous sailors, maps, and exotic animals brought from Hannibal's gamble would echo here too, turning Europe's skyline into a reflection of seas rather than legions. Education in this world would be radically different as well. Roman education focused on rhetoric, law, and military discipline. Carthaginian priorities would have reshaped schools into academies of navigation, agriculture, and commerce. Instead of memorizing Cicero, students might pore over Punic scrolls detailing wind patterns, crop cycles, and trade negotiation techniques. Astronomy would be a core subject, not just for philosophy, but for practical survival on voyages. Geography would not be abstract, it would be a sacred science, tied to identity. Punic universities could have sprung up centuries before Bologna or Oxford, with campuses overlooking harbors, classrooms echoing with the cries of gulls. Degrees might not be in law or theology, but in map-making, shipbuilding, or agri. Teachers would not be philosophers detached from life, but seasoned sailors, traders, and farmers passing down hands-on wisdom. Hannibal's gamble, victorious, would have inspired not the glory of empire but the glory of knowledge applied to survival and prosperity. The military traditions of Europe would transform too. Rome's armies were built around discipline, formations, and infantry supremacy. Carthage's forces, shaped by mercenaries and naval power, would inspire a different path. Standing armies might be smaller, replaced by rapid deployment, mercenary units, naval fleets, and coastal fortresses. War would not focus on land conquest but on controlling ports and seas. Cavalry could play an even larger role, inspired by Hannibal's brilliant use of Numidian horsemen. Instead of Roman legions carving roads across Europe, Punic patrols might dominate rivers, building fleets for inland waterways. Strategy manuals would not emphasize sieges and legionary formations, but deception, ambush, and the clever use of geography. Even the concept of military honor could shift. Less about standing firm on battlefields, more about striking fast and vanishing like waves. Europe's entire concept of warfare might look closer to piracy, privateering, and raiding than to the rigid campaigns Rome demanded. Economics in this alternate world would blossom under Carthage's fingerprints. Rome built wealth on conquest and tribute, draining resources from conquered lands. Carthage thrived through commerce, negotiation, and trade treaties. If Hannibal had won, Europe might have inherited an economic system centered on contracts, partnerships, and long-distance exchange. Guilds of sailors, merchants, and craftsmen would dominate, shaping politics as much as any general. Gold might be less important than grain, wine, and textiles, traded across vast networks. The very idea of wealth would not be about owning land, but about controlling routes and contracts. Cities like London, Amsterdam, and Venice might have risen far earlier, inspired by Punic models. Instead of empires hoarding wealth through conquest, federations of trading cities might dominate, connected not by roads, but by sea lanes. Hannibal's gamble would have created not just a new political order, but an entirely new economic vision for humanity. Entertainment would transform to taking cues from Carthaginian culture. Rome loved its blood sports, gladiators, and chariot races. But under Carthage's dominance, entertainment might have leaned less toward violence and more toward spectacle rooted in travel and cultural exchange. Festivals could have centered around ships returning from voyages, unloading exotic goods, animals, and performers from faraway lands. Storytelling would take center stage, with traveling bards recounting Hannibal's campaigns and merchant adventures. Music could blend African drums, Iberian strings, and Levantine chants into a hybrid soundtrack for Punic civilization. Instead of gladiators dying in arenas, sailors might compete in daring races across bays, with entire cities cheering. Markets could double as theaters, where trade deals were celebrated with dances and rituals. Carthage's worldview valued survival and prosperity, not endless conquest. Entertainment, too, would reflect this, less about cruelty, more about shared wonder. Law under a Punic victory would feel less Roman and more mercantile. Roman law became the backbone of Europe's legal systems. But if Carthage had triumphed, laws might have focused on contracts, trade disputes, and maritime codes. Courts would not revolve around land ownership but around shipwrecks, broken treaties, and unfair exchanges. Judges might be former traders, applying practical wisdom instead of abstract principles. Concepts like citizenship and empire could vanish, replaced by membership in trade leagues and federations. Punic law might have influenced even Asia and Africa, creating a global maritime code centuries before modern shipping laws. Hannibal's gamble would live on in every signed contract, every naval treaty, every debate about tariffs. Instead of Rome's obsession with citizenship and land tenure, the world would have inherited a legacy of negotiation, compromise, and commercial arbitration. In this alternate world, the courtroom would look less like marble halls and more like bustling docks, where justice was measured in goods and agreements. Religion in a Punic Europe might have evolved into a syncretic blend, mixing African, Mediterranean, and even Northern European beliefs. The worship of Baal Haman and Tanit might have merged with Celtic gods, Egyptian rituals, and Iberian traditions, creating a pantheon as diverse as Carthage's trade networks. Temples could stand at every harbor, serving as both spiritual and economic hubs. Festivals would not only honor gods but also mark trade milestones, the opening of routes, the safe return of fleets, the harvest of vital crops. Over centuries, Christianity might still emerge, but it would be filtered through Punic pragmatism, perhaps reshaped into a faith centered on survival, trade, and the ocean. Saints might be remembered less for martyrdom and more for guiding ships, saving merchants, or inventing agricultural techniques. Hannibal's gamble would ripple even here, ensuring religion itself was tied to the sea and survival. The social order in Europe would look radically different as well. Roman society divided people rigidly. patricians, plebeians, slaves. A Punic system might have been more fluid, based on wealth, trade skill, and connections rather than birthright. Merchants could rise to power more easily, and alliances between different cultures would be encouraged by necessity. Slavery might still exist, but perhaps with a stronger focus on integration and eventual freedom, since Carthage relied on diverse peoples to fuel its economy. Intermarriage between Africans, Iberians, Gauls, and Mediterranean traders could have become the norm, producing a more cosmopolitan society. Identity would not be tied to bloodline but to harbor, guild, or trade route. Hannibal's gamble would thus create not just a political and military shift, but a profound social transformation one, where being Punic meant being part of a vast network rather than a single rigid state. Finally, the memory of Hannibal himself in this alternate world would be legendary beyond imagination. Instead of fading into the footnotes of Roman history, he would be the cornerstone of world mythology. His march over the Alps would be retold not as a daring gamble that ended in failure, but as the pivotal moment that saved Carthage and reshaped the world. Children might grow up playing games named after his campaigns, while storytellers would compare every bold leader to another Hannibal. In theaters, actors would reenact not Julius Caesar's rise but Hannibal's victories, his cunning strategies, his elephants thundering across mountains. His image could adorn coins, temples, and even ships. The very word Hannibalic might mean daring, bold, unstoppable. If Rome gave the world Caesar and Augustus, this alternate history would give it Hannibal, the man who rewrote destiny. If Hannibal had reshaped history, Africa's role in the ancient world would have grown far earlier. Instead of being seen as a periphery to Rome, North and Sub-Saharan Africa could have been the beating heart of global trade. Imagine caravans moving salt, gold, and ivory from the Sahara, all flowing through Punic-controlled ports into Europe. Carthage's dominance would pull African kingdoms closer to the Mediterranean centuries before Rome or Islam did. Timbuktu or Ghana might have risen earlier, becoming vital partners in Punic alliances. The image of Africa in European imagination would not be of distant mystery but of central importance. The connection between continents would be organic, tied by trade winds and merchant fleets. In this alternate world, African voices, goods, and ideas would be woven into Europe's identity far earlier, shaping philosophy, religion, and science with an unmistakably African tone. Hannibal's victory would mean Africa would never be ignored. It would be celebrated as the other half of the Punic Mediterranean. The Atlantic might have been crossed long before Columbus or the Vikings. Carthage already had a tradition of daring voyages, with records suggesting Punic sailors may have reached as far as West Africa or even beyond. If Hannibal's triumph had guaranteed Carthaginian dominance, that spirit of exploration could have intensified. Merchant fleets might have ventured across the Atlantic centuries earlier, mapping Caribbean islands or South American coasts. Imagine Punic colonies in Brazil or Cuba around 200 BCE, bringing back maize, potatoes, or exotic birds. Europe's age of discovery would have happened 1,000 years ahead of schedule. With Punic pragmatism, the drive to explore would not have been about empire but about trade and survival. Contracts would have funded expeditions, guilds would have backed sailors, and families would have celebrated the profits of far-off ventures. The New World might never have felt new at all. It could have been Punic long before Rome faded into legend. Even Asia's history might have shifted. Rome's Silk Road connections were limited, dependent on middlemen. Carthage's dominance in trade could have opened stronger, earlier links to India and China. Imagine Punic traders bringing silk, spices, and porcelain to European harbors centuries before Rome even dreamed of it. The Mediterranean could have turned into a global crossroads, blending Mediterranean, African, and Asian influences in one vibrant marketplace. Europe's appetite for spices might have exploded earlier, creating a culinary revolution centuries before medieval kitchens experimented with pepper or cinnamon. This interconnectedness could also have reshaped technology. Papermaking, gunpowder, and compasses might have reached Europe far earlier, accelerating history itself. Hannibal's gamble, victorious, could have collapsed the distance between continents long before the modern world arrived. Instead of waiting for Marco Polo, Europe might have had its first Chinese traders docking in Punic harbors By the 2nd century BC, the image of empire would be radically different. Rome built a monolithic state that demanded loyalty to one emperor, one language, and one army. Carthage's victory might have created something closer to a loose federation, tied together by trade routes and contracts, rather than rigid chains of command. Cities like Athens, Alexandria, and Carthage might have been equal partners, each governing their local affairs, but united under shared commercial laws. Instead of statues of emperors, markets might display plaques of trade agreements. Loyalty would not be to a ruler, but to a network. This federation might look less like an empire and more like the European Union 2,000 years ahead of schedule. Hannibal's gamble would mean Rome's centralized model would vanish, replaced with a web of interconnected communities, bound not by force, but by mutual profit. The word empire itself might carry a very different meaning in this alternate timeline. The legacy of warfare would evolve into something pragmatic. Rome glorified conquest, turning generals into gods and soldiers into legends. Carthage, if victorious, might have taught the world that war is a tool, not a religion. Hannibal's cunning would be remembered less for the blood spilled and more for the strategy behind it. Future leaders might not admire brute force, but deception, negotiation, and alliance building. Instead of Roman discipline, military academies might study Punic cunning. Hannibal's ambushes at Lake Trasimene, or his masterpiece at Cannae, would be the gold standard of military textbooks. Battles would be judged not by size but by creativity, by how efficiently goals were met with minimal cost. War would become an art of problem solving, not glorification of empire. In such a world, generals would be praised not for marching legions across continents, but for protecting trade, securing routes, and outsmarting rivals. Hannibal's gamble would redefine the meaning of victory itself. Cultural exchange would blossom under this mercantile order. Rome often absorbed cultures but demanded assimilation into a Roman mold. Carthage's model of survival, rooted in diversity, could have preserved and celebrated differences. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Iberian traditions, and African customs might have coexisted, each adding color to Punic markets. Instead of uniform statues of emperors, plazas could host multilingual storytellers and multicultural festivals. Music would blend Mediterranean instruments with African drums and Eastern melodies. Fashion might showcase silks from China, dyes from Tyre and furs from Gaul, all in one outfit. This cultural blending would feel natural, not forced. Carthage's openness to many traditions would make Europe less about singular identity and more about hybrid richness. Hannibal's victory would ensure history remembered diversity as strength, not weakness. Europe would not dream of being one culture under one empire, but a mosaic, alive with countless voices. Even the sciences would have developed differently under Punic dominance. Rome was practical but slow in scientific progress, focusing more on engineering than theoretical exploration. Carthage, with its reliance on astronomy for navigation and agricultural innovation for survival, might have pushed science toward discovery much earlier. Observatories could have been built in major harbors, tracking stars for navigation while uncovering patterns in the heavens. Agricultural sciences might have advanced rapidly, ensuring food for growing cities and avoiding the famines that plagued Rome. Mathematics would be practical too: geometry for building ships, trigonometry for plotting routes, and accounting systems for vast networks of trade. Instead of Archimedes being remembered in isolation, an entire Punic school of science might have flourished, producing innovations centuries earlier than in our world. Hannibal's gamble would have turned Europe into a cradle of applied science, pushing humanity into discovery long before the Renaissance. The environment of Europe itself might have looked different. Rome built endless roads, drained swamps, and reshaped landscapes to serve its armies. Carthage, less centralized, might have left more regions intact, focusing instead on ports and rivers, forests in Gaul, wetlands in Iberia, and coastlines across the Mediterranean could have remained richer and more diverse. The longer agriculture would focus on sustainability for trade rather than exploitation for tribute. Hannibal's example of mobility, avoiding head-on destruction, might have inspired policies valuing adaptation over domination. The Mediterranean's ecology might have been preserved in ways we can only imagine today. Europe's landscape could have been greener, less scarred by roads and imperial exploitation. a living reflection of Punic pragmatism. Hannibal's gamble might have saved not only cultures, but ecosystems, leaving behind a healthier world. Globalization, as we know it, would have begun centuries earlier, with Carthage connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia. The very idea of nations isolated from each other might never have existed. Instead of medieval kingdoms jealously guarding borders, trade federations would link harbors, caravans, and oceans. Languages would blend, goods would circulate, and cultural barriers would erode faster. By the year 1000, Europe might already feel like our modern world, cosmopolitan, interconnected, and buzzing with constant exchange. Hannibal's gamble would not only have reshaped the past, but accelerated the entire timeline of human history. A global village would not be a modern phrase, but a truth lived for centuries. Humanity itself would have grown up faster, learning lessons of cooperation and commerce far earlier. And perhaps most strikingly, the myth of Rome would never dominate imagination. No Caesars, no Augustan Golden Age, no Roman law shaping centuries of governance. Instead, the stories told around fires and in theaters would revolve around Hannibal, Carthage, and the Punic Confederation. The Alps would not be remembered as an impossible barrier, but as the stage of humanity's boldest gamble. Carthage's ships would symbolize progress, its contracts symbolize stability, and its diversity symbolize resilience. If Rome gave us empire and conquest, Hannibal's alternate victory would have given us trade, exploration, and adaptation as humanity's guiding stars. This world would be both familiar and alien, one where power did not flow from legions but from sails, where history was not written in marble but in the ink of contracts, and where the Mediterranean was not Rome's lake, but humanity's ocean. If Hannibal had reshaped the Mediterranean world, the balance between East and West would also look different. Rome historically looked eastward, conquering Greece, Asia Minor, and eventually Egypt. Carthage, though, leaned west and south, toward Iberia and Africa. If Carthage had triumphed, the cultural epicenter of Europe might not have been Athens or Alexandria, but places like Carthage itself, Gates in Spain, or even Timbuktu further inland. This would shift the intellectual and spiritual focus of the world away from the Eastern Mediterranean and toward a more Atlantic and African orientation. Think of universities established not in Rome or Constantinople, but in Carthage and Cadiz, centers of trade rather than centers of empire. Instead of Roman roads stretching east, Punic fleets would stretch across the ocean, pointing civilization toward new frontiers. Hannibal's gamble, victorious, could have turned the world's gaze away from the Aegean toward the wide, open Atlantic. The cultural identity of Europe would not have been forged in marble statues and triumphal arches, but in mosaics of harbors and markets. Roman culture celebrated conquest and victory parades, where generals displayed spoils of war. Punic Europe might have celebrated voyages, contracts, and innovations. Instead of triumphs parading chained captives, festivals might parade exotic goods, exotic animals, and newly mapped routes. Children might not play games imitating gladiators, but instead recreate merchants bargaining in the marketplace or sailors charting a course across seas. Public life would focus less on martial honor and more on commercial ingenuity. The arts would capture these values to epic poems about storms at sea, plays about clever traders outsmarting rivals, or songs about voyages into the unknown. The heartbeat of Punic civilization was survival through adaptation, not domination. Under Hannibal's vision, culture would thrive on exchange, not empire. Without Rome's conquest of Greece, Greek philosophy might have traveled west in slower, altered ways. Carthage, while aware of Greek thought, would not have absorbed it so fully. Instead, Punic Europe might have blended Greek ideas with African, Phoenician, and Iberian traditions. Plato and Aristotle might not be the cornerstone of European thought. They might have been one voice among many in a polyphonic chorus of ideas. Perhaps Punic schools would favor pragmatic wisdom, how to sail, how to farm, how to negotiate over abstract metaphysics. Imagine a Europe where navigation manuals were studied with the same reverence we gave Aristotle. Philosophy might have been practical, tied to solving everyday challenges, rather than speculating about ideals. Hannibal's gamble could have reshaped the very definition of wisdom. prioritizing survival and adaptation over theoretical perfection. Religion in this alternate Europe would not be driven by Rome's eventual conversion to Christianity, at least not in the same way. Carthage's polytheism was fluid, tied to trade and diverse influences. If Hannibal had secured victory, Christianity might still have spread, but through Punic pragmatism, not Roman centralization. The faith could have looked more decentralized, shaped by merchants and local councils instead of emperors. Saints might have been remembered as protectors of sailors, traders, or farmers, rather than martyrs to imperial persecution. Christianity might have merged with Punic traditions, celebrating festivals tied to the sea and commerce. The church's power might not have concentrated in Rome, but in coastal hubs like Carthage, Cadiz, or Alexandria. Hannibal's victory would mean Europe's faiths would remain pluralistic, diverse, and practical, less about hierarchy, more about survival in a world ruled by tides and trade winds. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in our history marked the so-called Dark Ages, but in a Punic-dominated world, there might never have been such a collapse. Carthage thrived on adaptability. It did not rely on rigid bureaucracy like Rome. Its networks of trade could bend under stress rather than shatter. Instead of centuries of economic decline, Europe might have remained interconnected. Punic guilds and federations could have maintained trade even during crises, ensuring cities stayed supplied. This resilience might have prevented the long stagnation Europe experienced. The Renaissance might not have been a rebirth, but a natural continuation of centuries of Punic prosperity. Hannibal's gamble could have erased the very idea of a dark age, leaving instead a long, golden twilight of steady growth. Even the Americas would enter history differently. Instead of Spanish conquistadors arriving in the 15th century, Punic fleets might have reached the New World 2,000 years earlier. Colonies could have formed along Caribbean coasts, mixing Punic settlers with local populations. By the medieval period in our world, these colonies might have already matured into thriving transatlantic hubs. Europe would not discover America. It would grow up alongside it. This would mean new foods. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes could enter European diets. In antiquity, reshaping agriculture, diseases, technologies, and cultures would cross oceans, centuries before they did in reality. Hannibal's gamble, victorious, could have made the Atlantic not a barrier, but a bridge. From the very start, the age of discovery might never exist. It would have been the age of Carthage. In such a world, Rome might fade into little more than a regional memory. Without empire, its city might remain a trading outpost under Punic supervision, remembered only for failed glory. Roman roads, aqueducts, and amphitheaters might never exist, or exist only in fragments. Instead of being immortalized as the eternal city, Rome might be described in Punic chronicles as a stubborn rival that fell to Hannibal's brilliance. Generations later, Romans themselves might identify as Punic citizens, adopting the language and culture of their conquerors. The myth of Roman superiority would never arise. Instead, Rome might be remembered as a lesson in overreach and arrogance. Hannibal's gamble would rewrite not just the future but the very memory of the past. The concept of citizenship, so central to Rome, might never have become a cornerstone of governance. Rome tied loyalty to the state with the privileges of citizenship, creating a template for modern nations. Carthage, however, valued contracts, alliances, and federations more than abstract rights. In a Punic world, identity might not be tied to a single empire but to membership in a guild, a city, or a trade league. This could have reshaped political theory entirely. Instead of citizens voting for emperors, merchants and councils might negotiate agreements. Democracy might not be modeled on Roman assemblies, but on Punic councils of elders, pragmatic and focused on survival. The entire Western political tradition, rooted in Roman ideas of citizenship and law, could have been replaced with Punic pragmatism. Hannibal's gamble would mean our politics today might look radically different, less about nations, more about networks. Education in this alternate timeline might also have accelerated the sciences centuries earlier. Rome valued engineering but resisted theoretical breakthroughs. Carthage, focused on survival and trade, would encourage innovation. Astronomy, cartography, and navigation could become advanced fields much earlier, driving technology ahead of schedule. Agricultural science might also flourish, ensuring food stability for diverse populations. Imagine a Europe where the scientific revolution happens not in the 17th century but in the 3rd century BCE. Punic guilds might fund research into ship design, metallurgy, or crop rotation, instead of waiting for Galileo to study the stars. Carthaginian astronomers might have charted planetary movements. Long before, Hannibal's gamble could have created a world where the scientific method itself was born not in Renaissance Italy, but in Punic harbors echoing with the cries of ghouls and the hum of trade. And above all, Hannibal himself would be remembered not as a tragic hero but as the founder of a new world. His image might stand in every harbor, carved into coins and monuments, not as a general defeated at Zama, but as the man who broke Rome and reshaped history. His story would inspire generations not of conquerors, but of explorers, merchants, and innovators. Hannibal's march over the Alps would symbolize the triumph of human determination against impossible odds. In theaters, in schools, in whispered tales, his name would stand beside Alexander and Caesar, but with a twist. In T's world, Hannibal would be the man who won. His gamble would not be remembered as reckless, but as visionary. The turning point where history itself bent toward seas, sails, and survival. Hannibal, the architect of a Punic world, would have become history's ultimate victor. Hannibal's victory would have reshaped not only politics, but the very psychology of Europe. Rome's legacy emphasized order, law, and conquest, embedding discipline into the Western mindset. Carthage's triumph, however, might have encouraged adaptability, negotiation, and resilience. Instead of viewing the world as territories to subjugate, Europeans might see it as routes to explore and partners to trade with. This outlook would influence generations, from children raised on Punic fables to philosophers reflecting on what it means to thrive. The Western identity might not be built on marching legions, but on sailing fleets. Not on citizenship and empire, but on contracts and collaboration. Hannibal's gamble would leave behind a cultural DNA that prized creativity and flexibility above brute strength. Architecture across Europe would have been radically different under Punic dominance. Rome's legacy of aqueducts, amphitheaters, and triumphal arches still shapes our cities today. But Carthage would have emphasized functionality, tied to trade, instead of colossal arenas for gladiatorial combat. There might have been sprawling markets with warehouses capable of storing goods from 3 continents. Harbors would dominate urban planning, designed with canals and breakwaters to protect fleets. Public spaces would celebrate commerce, adorned with mosaics of ships and waves, rather than images of emperors. Even palaces might resemble merchant halls, blending practicality with beauty. Where Rome left behind roads and colosseums, Hannibal's world might have left a network of ports and trading hubs. The lifelines of a Punic Europe. The role of women could have evolved differently too. In Rome, women's influence was limited, tied mostly to family and household. Carthage, however, offered glimpses of greater female participation in religious and civic life, particularly through the worship of Tanit. If Hannibal had won, these roles might have expanded. Women could have held positions in guilds, managed trade ventures, or served as priestesses guiding community decisions. Maritime trade required flexibility, and families often relied on women to manage affairs while men sailed. This might have normalized female authority in commerce centuries before Europe experienced movements for gender equality. The echoes of Tanit might have made Europe's story one of earlier inclusion, where women's leadership was a visible and accepted part of public life. The legacy of slavery would also have shifted. Rome's empire depended heavily on conquest and forced labor. Carthage, while still practicing slavery, leaned more toward integration of diverse peoples into its economic networks. If Hannibal had won, slavery might have taken a different trajectory, perhaps evolving earlier into systems of debt servitude, contract labor, or pathways to freedom. The cosmopolitan nature of Punic society would encourage mixing and cooperation rather than rigid caste systems. Over time, Europe might have moved away from the mass enslavement model and toward more pragmatic labor structures. This change would alter not only economics, but moral frameworks, leaving a world less scarred by the legacy of human bondage. Hannibal's gamble could have created a different conversation about human dignity centuries earlier. Science, in this alternate Punic Europe, would not be limited to engineering feats, but might blossom into theoretical exploration guided by necessity. Navigation would push astronomy forward, leading to earlier discoveries about the Earth, stars, and even planetary motion. Agricultural needs would fuel botany and chemistry, shaping medical traditions. Distinct from Rome's reliance on Greek models, trade would incentivize innovation, with shipbuilders experimenting with designs to handle longer voyages and harsher seas. Punic guilds might sponsor inventors, the way Renaissance patrons later did. This scientific spirit would push Europe toward discovery much earlier, giving humanity tools centuries ahead of schedule. Hannibal's gamble, victorious, would transform every harbor into a laboratory and every voyage into an experiment that advanced civilization. The odds would also reflect this mercantile worldview. Instead of sculptures glorifying emperors or gods of war, Punic art might celebrate ships, oceans, and prosperity. Murals might depict voyages across stormy seas. Mosaics could show markets buzzing with goods, and plays might dramatize negotiations between rival merchants. Storytelling would celebrate cleverness and adaptability rather than sheer conquest. Heroes would be sailors, traders, and navigators, not soldiers. Even religion would influence this, as rituals tied to Baal Haman or Taned might inspire festivals around fertility of the land and safety of Oit. The cultural identity of Europe under Hannibal's influence would be deeply connected to survival and prosperity, not endless war. Art would remind people of resilience, diversity, and the sea's eternal challenge. Economics under Punic Europe would continue to expand outward, forming networks that anticipated globalization long before our era. Carthage thrived on contracts and negotiation, and Hannibal's world would embed those principles into Europe's very core. Cities would grow not as capitals of conquest, but as crossroads of commerce. Guilds and councils would wield as much power as generals, ensuring prosperity was tied to cooperation. Wealth would not be measured in land, but in routes controlled, fleets maintained, and agreements honored. This commercial spirit could have reshaped Europe into a federation of prosperous cities, each tied by trade winds rather than imperial commands. Hannibal's gamble would give humanity not only a new political order, but a new definition of prosperity. Education systems would adapt to match Punic values. Instead of focusing on rhetoric and law like Rome, Punic schools might prioritize practical skills, navigation, map-making, astronomy, and agriculture. To be at the heart of curricula, children would grow up studying stars and winds instead of Latin grammar, preparing them for futures in trade or exploration. Teachers might be retired sailors or merchants, passing down lived experience. Libraries would collect records of routes, treaties, and harvest cycles instead of speeches and poetry. Knowledge itself would feel more hands-on, more immediately tied to survival and success. Hannibal's world would turn education into a direct tool for prosperity, ensuring every generation was prepared for the challenges of seas, markets, and negotiation tables. Social identity would also transform under this model. Rome tied identity to citizenship and empire, defining people as insiders or outsiders. Carthage, however, built a culture of inclusion, absorbing diverse peoples into its networks. In a Punic Europe, identity might be more fluid, tied to trade guilds, ports, or alliances rather than rigid states. A Greek sailor, an Iberian farmer, and a North African merchant could all share the same Punic identity. If they worked within the system, this flexibility would blur cultural lines, creating a more hybrid Europe much earlier in history. Hannibal's gamble would turn the Mediterranean into a melting pot, not by force, but by necessity. Belonging would be defined not by blood, but by participation in a vast and resilient network. Finally, the myth of Hannibal himself would echo across centuries. In our timeline, he is remembered as a brilliant, but ultimately defeated general. In this alternate world, he would be the founder of a new order, celebrated as the man who toppled Rome and reshaped destiny. His march over the Alps would not symbolize a daring gamble that ended in loss, but the turning point of world history. Festivals might honor his victories, statues might rise in every city, and children might grow up hearing bedtime stories of elephants crossing mountains. Hannibal's name would become synonymous with boldness, cunning, and resilience. If Rome gave us Caesar and Augustus, this alternate history would give us Hannibal, the Eternera, symbol of victory, vision, and the rewriting of human fate.